My name is Scott Galloway. I appreciate your time. And over the course of the next several minutes, we're going to talk a little bit about our take on the future of higher ed. And also, we'll see if we have any time for Q&A. So just to give you a sense of what we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about why we think the current situation, sort of higher ed, has held its chin out and is incredibly ripe for disruption. Our major theme around our work is that COVID is more of an accelerant than a change agent, and make some forward-looking predictions or speculate about how things might change or what some of the opportunity is. So obviously, ripe for disruption. If demographics are destiny, we have just the number of consumers pursuing higher ed is a real challenge right now. We also have several other trends playing against, or there's been a shift, if you will, in sort of the product, and that is we've seen a dramatic decrease in the number of people signing up for two-year institutions, and we've largely seen anemic growth across all institutions. And the ticket to the American dream still holds pretty strong, though, that despite the decrease in demand, we do have what I would call a caste system in the United States that not only is indicated by whether or not you pursue a degree or some sort of certification, but where you get that degree. And this just indicates just how important it is. I think a lot of the media stories around what a tragedy is around some of these universities not opening in the fall, and so much attention is because if you think about all the people in media, whether it's people deciding the stories, writing the stories, broadcasting the stories, I would bet the number of people, the percentage of people who have a degree, a college degree, is probably close to 98 or 99%. And again, this pans out across your income earning across the course of your lifetime, making somewhere between 3 and 5 times the amount of income as someone who doesn't pursue a college degree. And then there are a few things that America does really well. We make the best software, we make the best weapons, arguably the best media in the world. But we also have dominated for a long time. We have the best brands in higher education. Some of this is a function of what ails us, and that is we have pursued a luxury strategy, and that is one of the keys of luxury is scarcity. And these universities have purposely, in my viewpoint, choked supply and have kind of lost the script and are no longer public servants as much as they are luxury brands. It is difficult to argue, though, with the power of these organizations. I did a study about 4 years ago and tried to show that if you find an organization that has created more than $10 billion in equity value within a 12-month period, it's almost always within a bike ride of a world-class university, that they continue to be hubs or springs of innovation and human capital that has the ability to build extraordinary organizations that can accrete or create value faster than any organizations in history. And then, of course, we talk about income mobility still, some exceptional income mobility. What's interesting, though, is this begins to tell a different story, that where America moves forward, where America sees real progress, and what we have in America is a lot of prosperity. I would argue we don't have a lot of progress, but where we do see a lot of progress is what you would call kind of the non-name universities, where they take people from the lower quintile of income earning households and thrust them into the upper quintile. That if you're going to talk about where the promise of America really takes root in education, it's not at the name brand or the luxury class or the elite universities. It's in some of our great state systems that embrace the unremarkables and help them lead remarkable lives and have remarkable opportunities. I put this slide in just such that everyone can see that I have not changed a bit, but also to highlight, this is me in my senior year at UCLA, to highlight just how dramatically things have changed. In 1989, UCLA acceptance was 42%, now it's 12%. Just 5 years before that at UCLA it was 60%. So it's literally 5 times as hard to get into UCLA as it used to be. And as a result, the admissions directors there no longer have the latitude to admit unremarkable kids as I was. And it's easy to credit your character and your grit for your success and then blame the markets for your failures, but I have no illusions. The generosity of California taxpayers and the Regents of the University of California are the reason that I am here speaking to you. I found the article yesterday, the Gotcha article, talking about how it ends up that Berkeley and UCLA had let in, I think it was somewhere between 20 and 120 students who didn't deserve to get in because of donors or alumni. I would call that a Tuesday in the Ivy League. I think these organizations are still fairly strict about or still adhere to the notion of letting in the most deserving. Berkeley will graduate more kids from low-income households this year than the entire Ivy League combined. But anyways, my tuition at Berkeley, and I'm just using these ratios to talk about how dramatically things have changed. My tuition at Berkeley when I went to business school was $4,000, and the starting salary I had offers at approximately a compensation of $100,000, creating a ratio of 25 to 1. Fast forward today, the tuition is $100,000, and the starting salary on average is $140,000. So the ratio, if you will, of starting salary to tuition has gone from 25x to 1.4x. A home used to cost about 2.8 times what that salary, that MBA salary would yield you. Now it's 10x. So just as I think almost every decision by most administrators in higher education is with one goal in mind, and that is to reduce their accountability and increase their compensation. I think across our society, and education is playing an unfortunate role in this, we have affected a series of economic policies that try and do one thing, and that is facilitate an enormous transfer of wealth from young people to old people. Not because America has anything inherently against young people, it's just that young people don't vote. So the reason why we have the NASDAQ at an all-time high and then 1 in 5 children living in food insecure households is because we, unfortunately, 5-year-olds don't vote, whereas we drop off $300 of cash at every household that has someone 65 or older every week because they have the annoying habit of voting. Anyways, I still firmly believe that my industry is largely the agent of casting in the US. And if you look at the notion that you're 77 times as likely to get into an elite university if you come from a top 1% income earning household as from the bottom 50%, I think it's just hard to argue that if universities are the ticket to a better life in the United States, that primarily speaking, the two cohorts that gain this kind of Willy Wonka golden ticket to a better life at an elite university primarily come from two cohorts. And that's the children of rich people and freakishly remarkable 15 to 17-year-olds who we let in to kind of wipe Vaseline over the lens of the very uncomfortable truth that people in higher ed at elite universities are essentially hedge funds educating the children of our investors. So the prices have gone up. I imagine at this conference, the people in the room are going to learn or forget more about this than I'm ever going to know, but we know that prices have vastly outstripped inflation. And even if you account for aid and net aid or net tuition aid from some of the better resource universities, it's still vastly outpaced almost every industry, including healthcare, is my understanding that education costs have actually increased faster than healthcare costs. The thing that has highlighted kind of how crazy these prices have come is when Harvard decided it was going all online. And I realize there's some snark here, but I think it's an interesting analogy to think about how much money is invested. Netflix invests about $13-15 billion a year in intellectual capital and human capital to create IP and content that they then stream to people for $156 a year. And arguably, you could say that Harvard has become the most expensive streaming video platform in the history of the United States. So a semester abroad is something that we should all be thinking about, given that national priorities are just different in other nations where the average tuition is much lower. Obviously, they don't have the credential, they don't have the credibility, they don't have the amazing research, and they don't have the global branding. And in many of these countries, not nearly the percentage of people attend college, but there's just a different approach around pricing. And then we've seen universities put themselves in fairly vulnerable positions as they become more tuition dependent, largely because of a decrease in funding, especially at the state level. Depending on the account for federal revenue, it's either flat to slightly up, but obviously a lot of people discuss the fact that, or blame, if you will, the cut in state funding for the fact they've had to increase tuition so much. And I think that's part of the story, but I don't think it's the entire story. And that is, and I say this as a proud progressive, I think we have made a strategic error, and that is not, at universities, we've been very good at embracing people who don't look like us, but we're not very good at embracing people who don't think like us. And as a result, we've ended up with institutions that are so distinctly and fervently progressive that I think we have turned off 50% of our elected officials nationwide, and they're just less inclined to fund what they see as an orthodoxy that might be directly in contrast with their beliefs. And I think part of state legislatures and government officials falling out of love with higher ed in the United States is a function of the fact that we have not pursued diversity of thought. We've pursued diversity, but not diversity of opinion. Administrative bloat is extraordinary across almost every major university system. This is my alma mater, the University of California, where you've had 5 times the increase in management staff as it relates to faculty or students. And then we've also just seen the change in enrollment or the change in cost per full-time student. The administrative costs absolutely explode relative to the number of full-time students. The top 100 of the 100 highest paid civil servants in Massachusetts, about somewhere between 88 and 93 of them work for the University of Massachusetts. And you can see that the compensation, and I want to be clear, I think there's a 2-class system at universities where there are adjuncts, clinicals, lecturers who carry a lot of the water and don't have the job security, don't have the benefits, don't have the compensation. And then there's this guild or this aristocracy of administrators and tenured professors that, in my view, are dramatically overcompensated relative to their productivity or to their accountability. And it's not the dollar amount, it's the job security that effectively quite frankly, they just can't be held accountable for their productivity. I would argue at the business school that we haven't said anything that controversial in 30 or 40 years, and the notion that we need to protect them as we protected Galileo, I think that is nothing but faculty members awarding exceptionally expensive compensation to their colleagues that translates directly to student debt. Also incredibly high benefit costs for tenured faculty. And then we've seen a dramatic increase in salaries. So while the enrollment has not gone up a great deal, we've seen salaries skyrocket, and this translates to an absolute explosion in undergraduate fees. The Rolexification of universities, and you could argue they're not to be blamed for this. It's sort of a keep up with the Joneses, but I think it's hit sort of a new peak around some of these water parks that are to be being developed at universities. I would argue that these new facilities aren't as much for the students as they are for the alumni and the parents. This is my alma mater, the year I went there. Point of the video is just to show that UCLA was not very nice. It was not a place where you would go and look around and think, wow, it's so nice here, it's so blingy, as opposed to today. UCLA, I would say, is more the Ritz-Carlton or the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. It's just extraordinary. I wonder if our capital allocation is wise here. The building I went to business school in, Barrows Hall at Berkeley, was just awful, but I would argue it really didn't mean much in terms of my actual university experience. So finishing school for the elites, we talk a lot about the Ivy League. I think the Ivy League is almost unimportant as it relates to America. If you look at the total enrollment, the place we're going to make change or not make change is at our great public universities. I think that is really where we should be focused. I think Cal State colleges have a much greater impact on the health or the lack of health of America than the Ivy League. The Ivy League is drunk on exclusivity. They're no longer public servants. They're luxury brands. And I think it's almost, I don't want to say it's unimportant to the dialogue, but it commands a much greater degree of the oxygen than in terms of its actual impact. And then these universities take enormous pride in constraining their supply as they realize the key to a luxury brand is to choke supply. So at my university, NYU, they brag about every year that we rejected 88% or 85% of our applicants, which I would argue is tantamount to a housing shelter, boasting that they turned away nine of the 10 people that showed up last night looking for help. Stagnant growth across university enrollment at private nonprofits. There are some that have not lost the script. I think, again, the University of California is doing its best to ensure that their enrollments outpace outpace population growth. I think it's ridiculous that any institution, public institution, excuse me, or any university that is claiming nonprofit status would maintain its nonprofit tax exempt status if it didn't grow its seats faster than population growth. Stanford has recognized treble the number of applicants, increased its endowment tenfold in the last 30 years, but hasn't increased its freshman seats by one seat. So we still have at UC, and they are trying to expand enrollments. They're up 31%. Admissions rate, though, have been cut by 2/3 just in the last 20 years, and we've seen tuition explode 2.5-fold and double just in the last 20 years. And then obviously the problems, it's not a California problem. It extends across many states. This is the same data for the University of Massachusetts. So what we have here is, I think we're sticking our chin out, and the fist of stone meeting that chin is COVID-19. And this is my favorite graph of the year. I'm fascinated by data and charts, and this for me highlights what is happening with COVID-19. And that is e-commerce, and that is the percentage of retail transacted through digital channels, has increased about 1% a year since 2000. And by 2020, about 18% of all retail was done through digital channels. Within 8 weeks, it jumped to 28%. It doesn't look like we're going back. So we've had literally an acceleration of approximately a decade in 8 weeks. And we've had this across a variety of industries. Online grocery accelerated 6 years based on previous growth. We've had the number of Americans working from home advance a decade in 2 weeks. And again, these don't look to be cyclical. These look to be structural changes. And then some not great data here is that we have, if you will, more students or more young adults are now living at home than they are living on their own. So that trend has accelerated a decade. It was happening, it was creeping back up, especially across young men, but it has accelerated a decade. And we're seeing online education because of the number of people at home, because of COVID-19, pursuing or interested in online education has absolutely exploded. And then we're seeing a number of people who've decided or are questioning the value of a college education. And the data that I thought was pretty interesting is that supposedly 1 in 5 of Harvard's incoming freshmen are saying they are going to defer. And this is arguably the best brand in education. So you can see this sort of waterfall of demand destruction. And then the students seem to want to, especially the freshmen, would rather actually have a remote learning experience. But at the same time, universities, especially private ones and the ones with high tuition, have made these strident statements that we have a national obligation to reopen our universities, and that they are making these brutal cost cuts, including delaying construction of their gyms. And what we've seen is that this industry is somewhat constitutionally incapable of what I would call our real cost cuts. I think that this industry lacks the discipline and lacks the experience with having to face the economic realities that middle-class households and every company and almost every industry has to face on a regular basis. And as a result, sees themselves as so noble that they shouldn't really have to face or even discuss this thing called cost cutting. And what they feel are brutal cost cuts, don't even deserve that term. So I decided to look at or put together some research trying to assess who is most at risk of COVID-19 across the ecosystem or the business of universities. And let's be clear, it has a social mission, but most of these are in fact businesses. And we looked at value, and that is looking at 3 things: credential, experience, and education, based on rank, search volume, the experience as indicated by niche, the 15-year and 30-year NPV of the earnings increase they get from that certification and the instructional spend per student, and then all over the tuition to come up with an index or a proxy for the value of money spent at that institution. And then the other axis was vulnerability. And we looked at endowment per full-time student. So I would argue a place like Princeton that may not have the biggest endowment, it's in the top 10, but I don't think it's in the top 5, is bulletproof because the endowment per student is several $million. And then I also saw a point of vulnerability as the number of international students that the institution attracts, as I find that it's likely, and this is playing out, and it was pretty obvious at the time, that if you're paying full freight at a hotel and the guy running the hotel is a raging bigot and the hotel seems to be infected with this virus and the people running the hotel have 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the viruses and the deaths, you might say, I'm going to take the year off here. I would describe all of a sudden in the eyes of international students that U.S. higher education is expensive, but bad, but dangerous. And the dirty secret, I think a lot of universities advertise international students as their diversity. I think that's bullshit. I don't think it's diversity that makes our desire for international students so strong. It's the fact that they pay full freight. So divided into 4 categories. Thrive was obviously low vulnerability and high value. An example of a university that we believe will continue to thrive is UNC, very strong rank, huge search volume, an admit rate that makes it a quote unquote selective school, which I don't think is a good thing, but lends to its brand equity value, very strong student life, student experience, and fantastic bump in salary all over what is a pretty reasonable tuition, making this exceptional value. And then $131,000 per student in endowment, and less than 5% of their population is from international students, meaning that they're probably not vulnerable and can survive a shock like this. This shock could go on for several years, and UNC Chapel Hill would be fine. Survive, a decent rank, decent value. Use Purdue as an example here. Fairly reasonable tuition, good bump, great experience, decent ranking. Not as high an endowment or not as great as an endowment, and a little bit more international students, but still fairly insulated, fairly bulletproof. Struggle, Randolph, kind of a mediocre brand, as indicated by an exceptionally high admit rate. Again, I would argue that's probably a good thing, but makes them vulnerable. A mediocre to substandard experience for students, and very little bump in additional income earnings power across relative to the tuition. Good, actually a decent endowment, and low international students. So this is a school that has not what I call great value, but is not vulnerable. And then an example of a university that we saw as challenged or very vulnerable was something with a mediocre brand, very mediocre student experience, not a huge increase or huge bump, and exceptionally high tuition. At the same time, about an average endowment, and probably greater or more vulnerability to the loss of international students. So I put this research out. You never know with research what the response is gonna be. This had more responses than I was certainly anticipating. We usually get about 80 posts, comments. We got 360. We had about 72,000 clicks. We think about 25,000 people tried to download the data sheet, and we invite all of you to download the data sheet. The objective here was to create a tool that people at universities could use to better allocate their capital and catalyze a conversation. I also, within about 48 hours, received 3 cease and desist letters from people in their universities in the quadrants of struggle. I have been writing about big tech. I think of myself as someone who is unafraid to say provocative things about organizations and the people leading those organizations. But this was the first time I'd received a cease and desist letter, and was from higher education. I think there was a level of arrogance and self-aggrandizement that infects higher education, that makes them believe that they should not be subject to the same scrutiny as every company, every elected official is subject to in America. This was from the interim chancellor at the University of Massachusetts, asking me to apologize to her students, which I am not going to do, but I appreciate the invitation. By the way, University of Massachusetts hasn't seemed to increase its enrollment. The NPV of their graduates has not increased. The leadership there makes between $500,000 and $1 million, and the outcomes don't seem to be any better. So I would agree with the chancellor there that one of us owes her students an apology. So some of the updates to the working sheets: we've added colleges as we've found more reliable data. We've tried to update the search volume numbers and also the number of international students. And also I had several thoughtful administrators call me and say, when you have a quadrant called perish, you're not helping, you're adding to the problem. and that you could become a self-fulfilling, or your research could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And while we want to illuminate the data, while we want to catalyze the conversation, I don't want to be responsible for making things harder for these individuals, because the majority of them are good people working hard to figure this out. So we change that to challenge. And I would also like to add that we're very open to any other thoughtful comments, and we implement a lot of them around how our methodology can be stronger. And we've gotten a lot of positive feedback on the research. And again, I would encourage you to go to No Mercy, No Malice or profgalloway.com, and you can download the working sheet yourself and play with it as you want and create your own inputs. I would describe this whole trend as the great dispersion happening in healthcare and across higher ed, where we're finding that the real estate of campuses, hospitals, and doctors' offices are no longer the regulators for supply. That if you were to take 50% of courses online, you effectively double the supply and could move back to, say, 6-8 years ago in terms of admit rates with fairly modest incremental investment. So where do we think we're going? I just kicked off my class at Stern Brand Strategy. It's $7,000 to take the course, or about $1.96 million, largely paid for in debt, that delays household formation, delays purchases of houses, delays the optionality in terms of the careers these kids can pursue. So I get paid $163,000 a night. Granted, my agent takes about a 98% commission. Actually, I take 100% commission. I have returned all compensation from NYU over the last decade, and I want to be clear. I realize I'm in a position to do that, and most are not. But I get a lot of criticism for being part of the industrial education complex and then criticizing it. So this is about $163,000 a night. I just don't think that is sustainable. I think that is the mother of all chins sticking itself out. I'm now involved in an online education startup, $875 versus $7,000. Doesn't have nearly the value add, doesn't have the certification, doesn't have the in-class buzz, doesn't have the magic of spilling into adulthood, but it's about 1/10 the price. And I think this might be where a lot of higher ed is going, that there might be a mix of things such that you can blend a lower cost model. I think it's important in this conversation to not conflate higher ed with K through 12. I think a 19-year-old stuck at home from Tulane is a nuisance. I think a 9-year-old stuck at home is a tragedy. And we're already seeing that kids from lower income households are literally falling off the map in terms of their progress. We're seeing increased infection rates. Households has economically collapsed when young kids have to be at home. I just don't think that's the case. I don't think there's a cohort in history that is better prepared for a shock for this, both from a health or economic standpoint, than 19-year-olds stuck at home for an additional semester, typically from middle or upper income households, typically not subject to the virus. So I don't think the two are in any way analogous. And then we talk about the additional burden on parents, mostly on women, of K through 12 schools not opening. I think the new super spreaders are university presidents and chancellors who have decided that the virus should get the memo around the importance or the self-importance of higher ed. And we made a terrible mistake opening universities. I think in the history will be written that the super spreaders of this pandemic were red state Republican governors who either refused to close or opened too early, and very blue state university presidents who have decided that their endowment and their compensation takes precedent over the health of their communities and the Commonwealth. I think this is reckless and negligent. It reads to me like the opening scene of Contagion 2. I don't know about you, but I spent the majority of my sophomore year in college smoking marijuana and watching Planet of the Apes trilogy over and over, then going on campus and trying to find people I could party with and hopefully have sex with. And the notion that after 10,000 years of instinct telling these kids at this age that they are supposed to distance at an age where they are supposed to be finding friends, socializing, finding mates, the notion that somehow they are going to come to at Northeastern University, they're going to invite 14,000 people to a 0.1 square mile campus. And then when they get too close and they find 10 of them in a dorm room, that they decide to kick them out and then keep their tuition. I don't think that's an error. I think that's criminal. And I think that this just couldn't have been planned any worse. And I think the gross idolatry of money has led us to some very ugly places with big tech and has now infected higher ed, that has decided again that their own endowment has led them down this rabbit hole of incremental bad decisions that has resulted in something that I believe will be disastrous for the health of the nation. We're already seeing it. There's been a spike state by state. The counties that are experiencing the biggest spikes tend to be counties with, guess what, a university. And this notion that somehow these kids, we're worried about that. I'm seeing these ridiculous studies saying they're worried about the mental health of young people because they can't go to college. Well, what's happened to the mental health of the 50 or 70% of Americans that never had access to a college education? I think that it has gotten to the point in terms of cost that we are now kind of morally corrupt. And I'll use myself as an example, charging kids $2 million, which is worse, preying on the hopes or preying on someone when they're really vulnerable, when they have a terrible inherited disease that makes their muscular atrophy expedite or go much faster. And then the good folks at a pharmaceutical company decide that when someone is this vulnerable to charge them $2 million for the treatment to potentially save their lives, or is it to charge middle-class families $7,000 in the form of debt so they can listen to me drone on for 12 nights? Which is worse, $2 million preying on one person during a very vulnerable moment, or charging middle-class households $7,000 as they attempt to build a better life for their children? I think the answer is yes. So what's the silver lining here? I think there's an opportunity to embrace big and small tech to dramatically decrease the incremental costs of educating more students. That ideally we could substantially increase supply, bring down the cost per student, and as a result, move back to where college was in the 80s and 90s, where a judge or the assessment of the value of higher education's place in our society wasn't how many top 1% or remarkable kids we can turn into billionaires, but how many unremarkable kids we can provide great opportunities to. I think that's where we need to return, or that's where higher ed needs to return to in terms of its role in society. And I think that can be accomplished with innovation and an embrace of small and big tech. There's just no getting around it. Remote and technology-driven education is just much more efficient. And I'd like to think there's an opportunity for a grand bargain here where alumni, elected leadership, and universities willing to take a hard look at their cost structure to embrace technology and then ask for additional funds, but say for an increase in funds of 10 or 20%, expand enrollment and delivery and capacity by 50%, thereby taking university enrollments way back to where they were just 10 years ago. Again, UCLA 5 times as hard to get into than it was just 30 years ago. And even if we were to double the capacity at the University of California, we would just take admittance rates just back 10 years. That's how incredibly difficult it's become to get into these universities right now. There's also a big opportunity, I think, in arbitraging 2-year universities with 4-year to bring down the cost. I think what they're doing at Outliers is interesting. They've determined that calculus is a $2 billion industry that's been taught the same way for 100 years. So find the best instructor in calculus and then let people take it for $300 instead of $3,000, $4,000, $7,000 and show up with these credits. And then total savings across a mix of 2- and 4-year. Again, you lose a lot of the leadership and social training, but I do think that that's an interesting kind of hybrid model. And then I'm hoping that this crisis is deep enough to really catalyze a serious conversation around what it means to be a university and in the service of our public. So I'd like to think that we'll begin viewing ourselves again as public service servants and not luxury brands, opportunity to reduce costs and administrative bloat, and subject ourselves to the same scrutiny that every company and household has to go through on a regular basis, and then to leverage small and big tech to increase enrollment substantially while decreasing the cost per student and move back to a situation where the son of a single immigrant mother can get a remarkable education and end up presenting to thousands of people in webinars such as this one. So I do think that universities are currently the lubricant for the caste system as opposed to upward mobility. I think we've lost the script. I think disruption is overdue. I think a reckoning is here, and it couldn't happen to a more deserving group of people. I do think there's a bigger silver lining around embracing big and small tech and moving back to the notion that we need to offer unremarkable kids remarkable opportunities instead of turning remarkable kids into billionaires. I do these sprints, but I also want to invite you to my free webinar on winners and losers in a post-corona world on October 6th, where we talk about how education, markets, and business will change post-corona.
Could you comment on universities like USC and Boston that are very popular among international students?
Yeah, so first off, I think that a lot of people say the crown jewel of California is the University of California, and I'm subject to that because I went to UCLA and Berkeley undergrad, but I really think the fuel, or I don't know what the term is, the crown jewel, the rare earth material of California is our California state system that charges $7,000 and $17,000 tuition in-state and out-of-state, 500,000 students, totally bulletproof to COVID because 88% of the people are commuters, good value, good kids looking for certification, working adults, some in their 30s or 40s. So Cal State is a gift. It's a gift to California, and it requires or deserves more attention, more resources, and more of our praise. I think a school like Stanford, which in the midst of the pandemic decided to cut costs and cut the swimming, I think, in the volleyball team, and I'm a bit biased here. I rode crew at UCLA, and it was exceptionally important in my development in terms of grit and discipline. And they were asked the question of, well, if you have a $35 billion endowment, why wouldn't you dip into that? And they said that, well, because this capital is committed for capital calls for alternative investments. So Stanford has basically come out and said, we're no longer a university, we're a hedge fund. And I think they should be taxed as such. I don't think Stanford has any interest in being a societal good. I think they have an interest in increasing their own prestige and not much else. And then some of the other universities, MIT, the elite universities, embracing big and small tech. It's going to be great. They're going to do a good job. It's mostly a brand builder. You know, I think these universities are just so out of touch with the needs of America. Elizabeth Warren said in the Democratic presidential debate, accused Pete Buttigieg of doing a fundraiser in a wine cave. Elizabeth Warren teaches at a wine cave. Harvard is essentially, Harvard is basically, as far as I can tell, finishing school for very, very wealthy people. And the neosporin of our guilt around this is we reach into the inner city to find some freakishly remarkable kids. But I can convince all of you mathematically that 99% of our children are not in the top 1%. And that's absolutely not a judge of a society. What we do with our 1%ers, they're going to be just fine. So anyways, I got a little bit off track there, but I think some of the state systems, Michigan, Texas, Florida, I think that's where our public institutions that have tried to keep costs down and are serious about expanding enrollment, I think that's where America returns to its legacy of loving the unremarkables.
Any thoughts on, there's some questions on international, particularly countries like India can leverage the crisis to push higher ed. Have you done any work outside the US, Scott?
I haven't. I'm just so disappointed. We have 400,000 international students. The CEOs of MasterCard, Microsoft, Adobe all came here on student visas. I find it just so disheartening that we wouldn't be more embracing of international students, not only morally, not only because our secret sauce is people coming here and falling in love with America and deciding to stay and build great companies and create jobs and tax revenue for us, but that we would just be so openly hostile towards international students, 400,000 of them, supposedly responsible for hundreds of thousands directly of jobs and about, I think it's something like $4 billion in revenue to higher ed. So the xenophobia, racism, and outright stupidity and bigotry that is our approach to international students right now is not only short-sighted, it cuts off the oxygen of our economy and our growth. So that wasn't the question, but it was a chance for me to riff on the notion that we would do anything but be more welcoming and smarter about our international students. You're going to see foreign universities surge, just as China in the last 5 months has usurped the baton of global leadership from America. You're going to see a lot of foreign universities take advantage of this crisis and pop into the top 20 or the top 30 by most rankings. And a lot of these kids are going to decide to go to school in France as opposed to California. So I see it as a terrible decision on our part. Some of what I just call just blatant discrimination against international students.
Tenure, any comments on tenure? There's a question in here on that.
I get a lot of pushback on this, and a lot of it is warranted. There are disciplines that require, especially as evidenced by this administration, that require protection. I would argue there's a lot of departments that are tenure is nothing but ridiculous compensation that results in a group of people who are not only unproductive, but obstructive and are just overpaid and difficult because they can be. And I think at the business school, I don't think we need protection. I don't think we've said anything, whether the reform and gap accounting rules should go one way or dark water or blue water economics. I don't find that these are that controversial and that there's a philosophical argument that they require some sort of lifetime employment or appointment so they can have freedom to talk about the Black-Scholes method. So I find in several departments, tenure is nothing but compensation, unwarranted compensation between colleagues, as is, I think, a lot of this peer review research, which I find in business schools just almost meaningless. And it directly translates to what is one of the greatest transfers of wealth in history, and that is $1.6 trillion in the form of student debt from middle-class households to universities and universities administrators over the course of the last 20 years. So I think tenure, I think there needs to be a class trader among the deans that stops awarding tenure. And I don't think, especially across things like business, we're going to suffer for it, or society is going to be a more dangerous place with less thought leadership. I think it would free them up to actually compensate deserving lecturers more. There are a big cohort of people at universities who are making a lot less than they should because they are funding this immovable object that's very expensive called tenure, that have to teach a ton of classes at below market compensation because so much capital has to go to this, what I would call this ridiculous guild called tenure across some of the non-humanities departments. So it's a mixed bag. I realize it's hard to just say tenure good or bad, but my own personal experience with tenure at the business school at NYU is that it is nothing but additional compensation to people who don't deserve it, and it results in a lack of investment in other areas that would serve the community and even the faculty if we got rid of it.
All right, I think we're coming towards the end. You got a lot of questions. You want to talk Title IV?
I don't feel as if I have the domain expertise to comment thoughtfully on it.
Okay. Why do you think strong state-level public institutions do not want to expand online enrollments, which would obviously not be true of ASU, so amongst others, but
because there's something called a faculty that has exceptional power at these universities, has entrenched interest in the status quo, is uncomfortable with technology because the majority of the people who have power at universities right now are faculties in their 50s, 60s, and 70s that want to tell the same story over and over in class in a format that they're comfortable with. And also, when my class used to be 160 students every fall because it was constrained by space. There were 160 seats in the Kauffman Management Center, room 260. When I informed my dean I was not coming on campus until there was a vaccine, they were very cooperative, very understanding, and said, in exchange for that, will you take the cap from 160 to 280? I said yes. That means there's 120 fewer kids to be dispersed across other marketing faculty, which means our mediocre faculty, of which I think NYU has fewer mediocre faculty in the business school than most business schools, 70, 80% of us. I have fewer students and fewer class enrollments, and they are kind of a bright light is being shown on some of the mediocre teaching in these universities when technology lets students pick exactly who they want, and there's a flight to quality. So unfortunately, when technology is injected into any process, it creates extreme winners and a lot of losers. But and the faculty are smart people. They have entrenched interests, and they will fold their arms and ask a lot of very thoughtful questions around technology, and it never goes anywhere. And the people assigned to technology end up on the island of misfit careers, and would just rather, anyone who's any good at it would just rather go to an organization that is embracing technology instead of deploying a delay and obfuscation around its implementation. There are some standouts. ASU has decided to embrace technology. There's a few institutions that have, but for the most part, it is seen as a threat. It is seen as the kryptonite to our Superman.
fantastic. All right. Well, you don't hold back, which we knew. We appreciate and thank. I really appreciate you being on today, Scott. This was you got huge response here, and I think you're going to see massive downloading of the presentation, both your slides and your video. And I'm sure you'll see a lot of people sign up for your sessions on week after next, I guess, or next week. So thank you, and for closing out our sort of first virtual pre-show, and certainly people have a lot to think about.
Thank you, Deborah. Stay safe, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, Scott. With that, I think it's a wrap on our virtual pre-show. I just want to remind everyone that a fuller program begins on the September 29th. It actually starts at 7:30 in the morning Pacific time with networking, followed by an Indian EdTech session at 8 Pacific time. Actually, is a yoga session available at 8:30 Pacific time. We have yoga starting every morning at the summit. Leading Educator Innovation Showcase, and then our StageX first presentations at 11 Pacific time. So encourage everyone to go on, look at the agenda. It's a very rich agenda, and it's worth spending a little time on to find the things that you're most interested in. Also, all of the sessions are being recorded. They'll be posted at every evening. You can either go through the ASU GSB Summit website to get there, or go into the Visivo platform where you registered for the overall event. And as I said, we will make Scott Galloway's slides available. So thanks everyone very much for spending your time with us today. All right. See you next week.